Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
There are moments in history that read less like documented truth and more like the dark script of a dystopian novel. Moments when institutions designed to preserve order and justice become silent laboratories for cruelty and unchecked ambition. When the public thinks of prisons, they imagine cells, concrete walls, and barbed wire fences. But in the mid-20th century, in certain corners of the United States, some prisons were transformed into places where science crossed into the realm of horror. For decades, prisoners were not only deprived of freedom but were used as unwilling test subjects in medical experiments, injected with deadly viruses and diseases under the guise of research. The most infamous of these prisons was Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia, a name that for many carries with it the memory of one of the darkest chapters of medical experimentation on American soil. The story begins in the atmosphere of post-World War II America. The revelations of Nazi medical atrocities at Nuremberg had shocked the world. Doctors who carried out brutal human experiments were tried and condemned, and out of that trial came the Nuremberg Code of 1947, which insisted that voluntary consent was an absolute requirement for any medical research involving human beings. And yet, even as American judges condemned Nazi doctors for experimenting on concentration camp prisoners, researchers in the United States were quietly preparing to do something chillingly similar. In their search for cures, treatments, and military advantages during the Cold War, American scientists began to view the incarcerated population as an available and controllable group of human test subjects. Holmesburg Prison became the centerpiece of this history. Built in the late 19th century, it was a crumbling, overcrowded facility by the mid-20th century, filled with poor men, disproportionately African American, many of them with few legal resources to resist authority. It was in this environment that Dr. Albert Kligman, a dermatologist from the University of Pennsylvania, entered the prison in 1951. Kligman initially came to study skin conditions among inmates, but quickly he realized that the prison presented him with what he would later describe as an anthropoid colony, a place where he could test medical hypotheses on a contained human population. His words, recorded years later, shocked many with their coldness, as he admitted to feeling like a botanist discovering a new field of plants to experiment on. Over the following decades, Holmesburg turned into a research center disguised as a prison. Kligman and other doctors carried out hundreds of experiments, many sponsored by pharmaceutical companies and, at times, by the U.S. military. Inmates were paid small sums of money, sometimes just a few dollars, to participate in experiments they did not fully understand. What began with seemingly harmless dermatological tests, such as checking skin reactions to creams or lotions, soon escalated into a far more sinister range of projects. Prisoners were injected with viruses, bacteria, dioxins, and chemical agents whose effects were unpredictable and often harmful. The atmosphere was one of exploitation masked as scientific progress. Among the most alarming cases was the deliberate injection of inmates with viruses such as herpes simplex, wart viruses, and even hepatitis. These studies were framed as efforts to better understand viral diseases and how they spread. Prisoners were exposed to pathogens that caused painful sores, long-term illness, and sometimes permanent damage to their health. The experiments often offered no real medical treatment afterward, and many inmates were left to suffer through the infections without adequate care. Some of the viruses, like hepatitis, carried lifelong consequences. Inmates who had once imagined that participation in the trials might shorten their sentences or offer them extra income found themselves permanently scarred by diseases that would follow them long after release. The military's involvement added another layer of darkness. During the Cold War, fears of biological warfare drove the U.S. Army to explore how viruses and chemical agents could be used in battle, and prisoners were seen as the perfect test subjects. Holmesburg became one of several prisons where military-funded experiments were conducted. Inmates were exposed to chemicals related to Agent Orange, the defoliant later used in Vietnam, which contained dioxins known to be highly toxic and carcinogenic. These substances burned skin, damaged immune systems, and sometimes led to cancer years later. The prisoners rarely knew what they were being injected with, and consent forms, if they existed at all, were written in obscure scientific language that obscured the true dangers. The rationale behind these experiments was always framed as utilitarian. Researchers and government officials argue that knowledge gained from prison experiments would save countless lives on the battlefield or in hospitals. But the reality was that these men were stripped of their humanity, reduced to test animals in a laboratory. The power imbalance between doctors and prisoners meant that even the idea of consent was a cruel illusion. When freedom, money, and basic dignity were already denied, how could an inmate truly refuse? The horror of Holmesburg was not an isolated event but part of a larger pattern of unethical medical experimentation in the United States. During the same decades, the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study allowed African American men in Alabama to suffer untreated syphilis so doctors could observe the disease's natural course. In Guatemala, in the 1940s, U.S. researchers infected prisoners and mental health patients with syphilis and gonorrhea. These episodes all share the same logic. Those on the margins of society could be sacrificed for the supposed advancement of medical science. At Holmesburg, the results were devastating. Many prisoners left the facility with permanent scars, both physical and psychological. Some developed chronic illnesses from exposure to viruses or toxic chemicals. Others lived with disfiguring skin conditions. Families of former inmates later spoke about how their loved ones never recover from the trauma, how they carried the memory of being treated as less than human, injected and observed like experimental animals. What makes this chapter of history even more unsettling is how long it remained hidden. For decades, few outside the prison walls knew the extent of what was happening. The University of Pennsylvania continued to support Kligman, who built a prestigious career as one of the most prominent dermatologists in the country, credited with developing products like Retin-A, a treatment for acne. Only in the 1970s and 1980s, as investigative journalists and former inmates began to speak out, did the full scope of Holmesburg's experiments come to light. The revelations shook public trust in medical institutions and raised questions about how the Nuremberg Code could have been so blatantly ignored in the United States. The legacy of Holmesburg is a painful reminder of the dangers of unchecked power. Inmates had little voice to resist, and society outside the prison largely turned a blind eye, dismissing the incarcerated as unworthy of the same rights and protections as other citizens. The fact that the experiments were conducted by respected doctors and funded by leading institutions only underscores how systemic the problem was. It was not the work of a few rogue scientists, but a reflection of a broader culture that accepted exploitation when it targeted the powerless. In recent decades, survivors of the experiments and their advocates have called for accountability. Lawsuits were filed against the University of Pennsylvania and the city of Philadelphia, though legal technicalities and statutes of limitations often limited the success of these efforts. The university eventually issued a formal apology in 2022, acknowledging that what occurred at Holmesburg was unethical and inhumane. This apology, though important, could not undo the suffering of those who endured the experiments, many of whom had already passed away. Today, Holmesburg Prison stands abandoned, its crumbling walls haunted by the memories of those who lived and suffered within them. For historians, activists, and descendants of former inmates, the story serves as both a warning and a lesson. It reminds us that ethical codes and declarations are meaningless unless they are enforced and respected in practice. It shows how prejudice against prisoners, the poor, and minorities can pave the way for abuses hidden in plain sight. And it underscores the need for vigilance in protecting human rights, especially for those who are most vulnerable to exploitation. The prison where inmates were injected with deadly viruses is more than just a chapter of medical history. It is a mirror reflecting society's capacity for cruelty when compassion is lost. It is a reminder that true progress in science can never come at the expense of human dignity. And it is a call to remember the voices of the forgotten men of Holmesburg, whose bodies became battlegrounds for experiments they never chose. Their suffering stands as testimony to the costs of disregarding justice in the pursuit of knowledge, and their story demands to be told as long as prisons and laboratories exist side by side.